Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here. So my name is Alison Fell. I am the Dean of the School of Histories, Languages and Cultures, which hosts the Institute for Irish Studies. And it's an enormous privilege for us here at the University of Liverpool to be welcoming you to the Annual Seamus Heaney Lecture. I can't tell you what a joy it is after a day of Zoom meetings to be in a real room about to enjoy some wonderful poetry and a wonderful talk. I've not been at the University of Liverpool very long. I arrived in August, but one of the attractions of coming to the University of Liverpool was in fact the Institute of Irish Studies. I am married into a very large and very welcoming Irish family, so it was one of the few ways in which I've impressed the Irish side of my family. I think that there are a number of things that are really unique about the Institute. One of the things is its interdisciplinary research that really blends politics and literature and history, which I know is a feature of our speakers' work as well tonight. Another feature is the way it's so collaborative, and I think it's an example of that collaboration that we're also going to enjoy this evening. So welcome again, and I'm now going to pass on to Professor Pete Shirlow, the Director of the Institute.
It's great to be back. This is our first event we've had here in the university, and it's great to see you all again, even though I can't really see you. I can just see your glasses and your eyes and your hair, but I know who you are behind the mask. So it's brilliant that you're all here. And of course, it's brilliant that the Heaney family have joined us again. And you know that this is the third lecture. And the first year we had Adrian Dunbar, who read the poems. Tonight we have Sinéad Cusack. And of course, it's wonderful, of course, to be celebrating the third annual lecture. Last year, of course, during that dreadful year, we celebrated the lecture through online. And one of the moments for me was the guy who grew up in a Palestinian refugee camp, and he didn't know any English, and somebody handed him a copy of Seamus Heaney's poetry, and that connection to place and the symbolism of place and the importance of place was something that he talked about very eloquently, and it just showed the spread and the impact of Seamus Heaney's work. I was actually a couple of weeks ago. It was during the weekend, Dean. At the weekend, I was lying watching Netflix, and or some other whatever way you watch TV now, and this documentary came up which had Seamus Heaney in it, and he was in his native county Derry, and he was standing beside a shuck. For those of you listening in English, a drainage ditch, okay, and he was standing beside the shuck, and this big smile, and he was talking about this shuck. And basically it had been a Celtic tribal boundary, it had been a Catholic ecclesiastical boundary, the Anglicans came in, it was their boundary, it was a tax boundary, it was the Orange Order boundary, it was everybody's boundary, and all the layers of history were explained by this shuck. And one thing I just realised was the whole generosity of this person who was so globally renowned and so intellectual and so scholarly. And he just had this big smile on his face like a boy from South Derry. And it was the beauty of that charm and that connection and that decency and all of that. And of course, tonight we could have many more here, except for COVID restrictions, but at least we're back, and that's the main thing. And we've had a lovely cup of tea, and we had a wee chat with everybody earlier on. And it is a lovely occasion, and I know people enjoy it very much. So, we're going to have a few poems, aren't we? And come up beside, you can come up, don't come too close until I walk away. Anyway, so this is Sinead. Okay. One of the things I really don't like doing, Sinead, is introducing people who everybody know. But they all know you, everybody knows you. And you're on TV. I was on Netflix or iPlayer, you're on the TV the other week. Anyway, so like we all know Sinead. We know Sinead's been a really prominent figure in drama, TV, movies, etc. Over the last decade. Being a charmer for several years. And the enthusiasm with which you wanted to come tonight and read the poems is something that we appreciate very much. So, we all know you, so we're now going to listen to you. Is that okay? Thank you very much, Sinead.
Hello, everyone. Well, I'm delighted to be here and very honoured that I've been asked to read these poems. I wish I had the beautiful cadences of Seamus, but I don't, because I'm a dub. But I'll do my best with the poems, but I won't attempt a Derry accent, okay, because it'd be shameful, wouldn't it? So here we go. Now, Professor Roy Foster, has chosen these poems, I think, to illustrate aspects of his talk tonight. So the first one we have is the Ministry of Fear. Well, as Kavanagh said, we have lived in important places. The lonely scarp of St. Columba's College, where I billeted for 6 years, overlooked your bogside. I gazed into new worlds, the inflamed throat of Brandywell, its floodlit dog track, the throttle of the hare. In the first week, I was so homesick, I couldn't even eat the biscuits left to sweeten my exile. I threw them over the fence one night in September 1951, when the lights of houses in the Lecky Road were amber in the fog. It was an act of stealth. Then Belfast, then Berkeley. Here's two Unser sophisticated, dabbling in verses till they have become a life. From bulky envelopes arriving in vacation time to slim volumes dispatched with the author's compliments. Those poems in longhand, ripped from the wire spine of your exercise book, bewildered me. Vowels and ideas bandied free as the seed pods blowing off our sycamores. I tried to write about the sycamores and innovated a South Derry rhyme with hushed and lulled full chimes for pushed and pulled. Those hobnail boots from beyond the mountain were walking, by God, all over the fine lawns of elocution. Have our accents changed? Catholics in general don't speak as well as students from the Protestant schools. Remember that stuff? Inferiority complexes, stuff that dreams were made on. What's your name, Heaney? Heaney, father. Fair enough. On my first day, the leather strap went epileptic in the big study, its echoes plashing over our bowed heads. But I still wrote home that a boarder's life was not so bad, shying as usual. On long vacations then, I came to life in the kissing seat of an Austin 16, parked at a gable, the engine running, my fingers tight as ivy on her shoulders, a light left burning for her in the kitchen, and heading back for home, the summer's freedom dwindling night by night, the air all moonlight and a scent of hay. Policemen swung their crimson flash lamps, crowding round the car like black cattle, snuffing and pointing the muzzle of a Sten gun in my eye. What's your name, driver? Seamus. Seamus. They once read my letters at a roadblock and shone their torches on your hieroglyphics, svelte dictions in a very florid hand. Ulster was British, but with no rights on the English lyric. All around us, though we hadn't named it, the Ministry of Fear. So there was that. Thank you very much. There's no need at all for that, except for Seamus's writing, which is just so beautiful. Anyway, this is called Clearances. This one makes me cry, so I'll try not to cry, but I pretty well always do. Anyway, when all the others were away at Mass, I was all hers as we peeled potatoes. They broke the silence, let fall one by one, like solder weeping off the soldering iron. cold comforts set between us, things to share, gleaming in a bucket of clean water, and again let fall. Little pleasant splashes from each other's work would bring us to our senses. So while the parish priest at her bedside went hammer and tongs at the prayers for the dying, and some were responding and some crying, I remembered her head bent towards my head, her breath in mine, our fluent dipping knives, never closer the whole rest of our lives. Yeah, makes me cry. And this one is Sweeney Redevivus. I stirred wet sand and gathered myself to climb the steep-flanked mound, my head like a ball of wet twine, dense with soakage, but beginning to unwind. Another smell was blowing off the river, bitter as night airs in a Scotch mill. The old trees were nowhere, the hedges thin as penwork, and the whole enclosure lost under hard paths and sharp-ridged houses. And there I was, incredible to myself, among people far too eager to believe me and my story, even if it happened to be true. That's Sweeney. And this is from Station Island. It's number 12 in Station Island. Like a convalescent, I took the hand stretched down from the jetty, sensed again an alien comfort as I stepped on ground to find the helping hand still gripping mine, fish cold and bony, but whether to guide or to be guided, I could not be certain. For the tall man in step at my side seemed blind, though he walked straight as a rush upon his ash plant, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Then I knew him in the flesh, out there on the tarmac among the cars, wintered hard and sharp as a blackthorn bush. His voice, eddying with the vowels of old rivers, came back to me, though he did not speak yet. A voice like a prosecutor's or a singer's, cunning, narcotic, mimic, definite as a steel nib's downstroke, quick and clean. And suddenly he hit a litter basket with his stick, saying, "Your obligation is not discharged by any common right. What you must do must be done on your own. So get back in harness. The main thing is to write for the joy of it. Cultivate a work lust that imagines its haven like your hands at night dreaming the sun in the sunspot of a breast. You are fasted now, light-headed, dangerous. Take off from here. And don't be so earnest. Let others wear the sackcloth and the ashes. Let go. Let fly. Forget. You've listened long enough. Now strike your note." It was as if I had stepped free into space, alone, with nothing that I had not known already. Raindrops blew in my face as I came to. Old father, mother's son, there is a moment in Stephen's diary for April the 13th, a revelation set among my stars. That one entry has been a sort of password in my ears, the collect of a new epiphany, the feast of the Holy Tundish. "Who cares," he jeered, "anymore? The English language belongs to us. You're raking at dead fires. a waste of time for somebody your age. That subject people's stuff is a cod's game. Infantile, like your peasant pilgrimage. You lose more of yourself than you redeem doing the decent thing. Keep at a tangent. When they make the circle wide, it's time to swim out on your own and fill the element with signatures on your own frequency. Echo soundings, searches, probes, allurements, elver gleams in the dark of the whole sea. The shower broke in a cloudburst. The tarmac fumed and sizzled. As he moved off quickly, the downpour loosed its screens around his straight walk.
That was just wonderful. Nearly cried myself, and I'm from Belfast. We never cry, except for when we cry. But anyway, that was just lovely and beautiful and very fitting for what this night is, which is about commemoration and memory and recognition. So now we move on to Professor Roy Foster, who's well known in this parish, has been here many times to speak on many things. Roy, of course, is the Irish historian of his generation, without any shadow of a doubt. He was the Carroll Professor of Irish History at Oxford and a Fellow of Hertford College. When you read through the list of fellowships that you've been awarded and which you've been offered, it further underlines what I just said. This is the Irish historian of a generation, and has produced many volumes and many wonderful pieces of work. His work on Lord Randolph Churchill, Paddy and Mr. Punch, Connections in Irish and English History, and one of my favourites, Luck and the Irish, A Brief History of Change, 1970 to 2000. And within that whole canon of work and awards, etc., has been your most recent work, Roy, which is on Seamus Heaney, which was published last year by Princeton University Press. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Roy to come and speak to you tonight about the work of Seamus Heaney. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you all for coming. I'm very honoured to give this lecture here at Liverpool, a place close to my heart. And I must thank Pete and his team for the invitation, and the Heaney family for all coming from Dublin, which I'm very touched by. I'm doubly honoured to be preceded by a reading from Sinead, one of my favourite actors and favourite readers of poetry. I still remember one of the first television programmes I saw a few years after RTE opened in 1961, which was a reading of Yeats's The Tower by Sinéad Cusack. And it was actually filmed very austerely in black and white in Yeats's Tower in County Galway. Sinead shares her father's extrasensory knowledge of how a line should fall on the ear, and it's wonderful to hear her apply this gift to Seamus Heaney's unique poetic voice. And Tourballylee, as it happens, was a kind of sacred space for Seamus Heaney, who visited it regularly, wrote marvellously about it. It's the subject of the first of his Elman lectures, published as The Place of Writing. It features in Frontiers of Writing, the conclusion to his great Oxford lectures. And there Heaney draws a kind of Yeatsian magical diagram of towers in Ireland. And it features buildings associated with Edmund Spenser, with Louis MacNeice, and with James Joyce, as well as the generic round towers of early Irish monastic tradition. And what he's doing is constructing a pattern of literary influence and correspondence stretching from medieval Irish poetry to the present. And I instance that because it's a formidable demonstration not only of Heaney as critic, but as prose writer. And that's going to be one of my themes this evening. This lecture, which has been in the making over the last few weeks, they very decently didn't ask me for a title, which was just as well. But the title I would have given them, the title it has now achieved, is probably Seamus Heaney the Novelist, with a query mark after novelist. Because specifically tonight, I'll be looking at the presence of fiction in Heaney's literary and poetic imagination, partly because it's a subject that I didn't have the space to address in my recent book, and partly because I've always been interested in the differences between the literary identities of poets and of novelists, who seem in so many cases to occupy different and mutually exclusive genres. This was put to me by my old friend, the distinguished poet and Heaney scholar, Bernard O'Donoghue, very happily in the audience tonight. I took Bernard to task once for a dismissive review he'd written of a novel which I admired, and he said sadly to me, "You see, Roy, poets don't know what novels are for." Now, I wonder, is this true? And you're not to contradict me, Bernard. You said it. It leads one to think about poets who do write novels and how they fare. Very often, I think it seems that a poet will try one or two novels before returning to a more hospitable muse. Philip Larkin wrote two novels, A Girl in Winter and Jill, which are accomplished in their way but are underpowered, with little of that lacerating edge that you find in Larkin's best poetry. Muriel Spark wrote and published poetry all her life, and indeed edited Poetry Review for the Poetry Society, but no one can doubt that her unique genius was for fiction, and she used her experience at the Poetry Society to fuel one of her most savagely funny novels. Emily Bronte's poetry receives more attention nowadays than it used to, but her immortality is surely conferred by her great novel, a novel which Swinburne actually judged to be essentially and definitely a poem in the fullest and most positive sense of the term. You can also find that early in a poet's life, they write a semi-autobiographical novel which seems to clear the detritus and allow for focused concentration on poetry. This is true of Stevie Smith's early novels, but not perhaps of her novel on yellow paper, which forecasts the wacky, offbeat, and somber nature of the poems to come. Sylvia Plath's ferociously introverted fiction, The Bell Jar, does, I think, read like an exercise clearing the decks for the poetry to follow. You could apply this judgment to Patrick Kavanagh's novel, Tarry Flynn, a book close to Heaney's heart, which is also a kind of Bildungsroman. Moving to another powerful influence on Heaney's work, W.B. Yeats wrote fiction early in life, notably the autobiographical exile novel John Sherman, and a series of occult short stories collected as The Secret Rose. And these have their admirers, but his real attempt at a major fiction was a rather hopeless book called The Secret Rose, which was, if you'll forgive, The Speckled Bird, which was, if you'll forgive me, an albatross round his neck for years and was never finished. It's of much more interest to the biographer than the literary critic, and that can be true, I think, of the kind of works I'm mentioning. Yeats's interest in writing prose fiction had evaporated by the time he was 40, though he continued to write wonderful prose, notably in his autobiographies, which have their fictional elements too. In our own day, accomplished poets such as Andrew Motion and Blake Morrison oscillate between poetry collections and novels, but the latter tend to deliver a rather muted and diluted effect. And it's hard not to think, if slightly mischievous, that they're motivated by publishers' advances as much as by inspiration. John Updike began and ended his writing career with poetry, and his posthumously published volume Endpoint is an extraordinary book, but his reputation will rest on the Rabbit novels, The Centaur, and some luminous short stories. The genre bending works better, I think, when a poet writes a novel that is in fact a prose poem, like Anne Carson's Red, or when a novel is actually cast in a poetic form, a story told in a sequence of chapters. Shelley's The Revolt of Islam, Byron's Don Juan, Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, George Meredith's Modern Love, Robert Lowell's The Dolphin, Vikram Sethi's The Golden Gate. Yeats tried this too with a narrative poem about wandering lovers called The Shadowy Waters. But this, like The Speckled Bird, remained unresolved, was published but never in a form that met his satisfaction. And the whole genre-bending fusion of narrative poem mutating into novel was comprehensively parodied by Vladimir Nabokov's tour de force Pale Fire, a novel which is ostensibly centered on a long poem in hilariously straight-faced Robert Frost mode, but which tells a totally different story through the incrementally crazed annotations and footnotes, the sort of trick Flann O'Brien used too. So, as a general rule, it seems that writers owe a primary allegiance to one form or the other, poetry or novels. The exceptions are very few. The major one that comes to mind is, of course, Thomas Hardy, a central figure in Heaney's pantheon. Hardy, almost alone in the English language tradition, wrote both great novels and poetry of the first rank. I anticipate many contradictions in the questions. There might be a case, and as we'll see, it was made by Seamus Heaney, for saying that James Joyce was a poet rather than a prose writer, and Joyce's early poems are very accomplished productions, much impressed Yeats. But when Joyce set out to change the expression and purpose of language, he cast the enterprise in the format of a novel. It could be said that when he moved on to Finnegan's Wake, he was returning to poetry, but I'll have to leave that there. It's a question, I suppose, of finding one's voice, which is sometimes a matter of making an unexpected discovery. Robert Frost famously told Edward Thomas that he was writing as good poetry as anybody alive, but in prose form, where it did not declare itself and gain him recognition. Thus he helped unlock the short but potent flowering of Edward Thomas as a poet. And the finding of one's right voice can come more easily. Heaney liked to quote Patrick Kavanagh's remark that a man dabbles in verses and finds they are his life. And we've just heard how he replays that into The Ministry of Fear, read so beautifully by Sinead. Kavanagh, Frost, Joyce, all key reference points in Heaney's imaginative life, so time to turn to the man himself. When asked by Denis O'Driscoll to distinguish between how he wrote poetry and wrote prose, Seamus Heaney downplayed the prose side of things. He said, prose usually equals duty, last minute, overdue deadline stuff, or a panic lecture to be written. I don't really buy this, and I don't think anyone could who looks closely at his prose. It's interesting too that when asked by O'Driscoll about accessibility and obscurity in poetry, Heaney moved quickly to discussing a great prose writer, Italo Calvino. He compared him, I quote, to a pastry chef of a high order who can do wonderful things. But because of the quality of intelligence and an eagerness of attention, what is indicated to you, in spite of the fluency and elegance of the whole thing, is a strength of mind, a sense that we are performing on the high wires here, but there's no safety net. This is serious stuff. And how is that transmitted? By the writing, by the tone, even one might say by the muscle tone, very characteristic reflection. Heaney was ferociously well read, as any examination of his literary criticism will show. Like Yeats, his brilliance and originality as a poet has led, I think, to a certain undervaluing of his importance as critic and commentator, though the recent book by Rosie Lavin, Seamus Heaney and Society, goes some way to remedying this. Lavin pays close attention to Heaney's youthful experience as a teacher and as a teacher of teachers, and his early ambition to put together anthologies of literature for teaching purposes. He would later put together poetic anthologies, notably with Ted Hughes. But the outlines of his teaching anthologies in his archives shows that fiction played as large a part as poetry in his selections, which isn't, I suppose, altogether unexpected. More surprisingly, in his prentice years in the early 60s, he was trying his hand at writing fiction too. The Queen's University magazine Gorgon contains, in a 1961 issue, a short story by Heaney, then 22 years old. Slightly contrived and awkward, it has a brutal payoff when the protagonist learns by accident that a long-ago girlfriend terminated her pregnancy with their child. Now, this is very strong stuff for Ireland, north or south, back in 1961. I think it's a fascinating item. The writing is straight, unadorned, not particularly distinguished, but there's a very memorable symbolic image of a dead dog floating in the sea with its belly swollen, very metaphorical. The influence of Sean O'Forlán seems palpable. It's an interesting item not only for the frankness of the subject matter, but for the fact that this is 4 years before his canonical pamphlet, 11 Poems, and 5 years before his first collection, Death of a Naturalist, propelled him to the forefront of his poetic generation. This short story is also written at a time when he was considering writing a postgraduate thesis on the repressed hero in modern Irish writing. And I suspect that O'Fallon's influence is powerful here as well, notably O'Fallon's novel Bird Alone. The thesis didn't get off the ground because no one in Queen's was interested in supervising it. Black mark for Queen's, I think. But the fact that it was implicitly to be about fiction and repression has considerable interest. By the time Heaney returned to the idea of writing a thesis 2 years later, in 1966, the subject was to be Patrick Kavanagh, which indicates the direction in which he was now headed. And Kavanagh, a powerful presence in the Ministry of Fear, as we've just heard. But remembering Heaney's enduring affection for Kavanagh's autobiographical novel, Tarry Flynn, it's probable that Kavanagh's prose as well as his poetry would have featured in the unwritten thesis. And this is indicated in a key 1975 essay by Heaney on Kavanagh, where he zeroes in on his subject's only novel. He wrote, "Kavanagh's destiny was to become a mendicant rather than a parish priest, called from his important places in Monaghan to consecrate new ground for himself on the banks of the Grand Canal in Dublin, to end up not like his own father Matt, a part of the place, natural as a round stone in a grass field, but as an embittered guru. Tarry Flynn in 1948 is Kavanagh's delightful realization of the call to leave, the pivot and centre of his work, an autobiographical fiction full of affection for and impatience with his parish. The book brings to fruition the valediction to every blooming thing promised in the poem Inniskeen Road, and in it Kavanagh achieves his first and fullest articulation of his comic vision, that view from Parnassus which was the one sustaining myth or doctrine he forged completely for himself. Towards the end of the novel there is an account of Tarry retreating to his upstairs room to compose verse, which is at once an account of the novel's genesis and an explication of Kavanagh's subsequent insistence on the poet's detachment, his duty to merely state the position. Kavanagh would remain a touchstone in Heaney's own autobiographical consciousness, as we've heard earlier. But it's striking that at this stage of his life, Heaney sees the novel as epitomizing what he calls the pivot and centre of Kavanagh's work. Any of us would think, no, it's The Great Hunger, his extraordinary and great poem. It's also noteworthy that Heaney didn't immediately give up writing fiction after becoming a published poet. In 1970, again as indicated in the Ministry of Fear, he was in Berkeley University, California, a moment of great liberation for him, as he made clear to Dennis O'Driscoll in his autobiography by interview, Stepping Stones. And this is borne out in his excited letters back home to friends. These are unpublished letters, but they make me thirst for Christopher Reid's forthcoming edition. On the 17th of October 1970, he wrote to David Hammond, "I've been writing like a whore." That's correct pronunciation, by the way. "I've done 2 short stories, but don't tell anybody." A month later, he writes to Seamus Deane that "I've written 3 short stories. I'm going to try fiction, by Christ." The influence of fiction writing friends in California, such as Leonard Michaels and Tom Flanagan, may be important here, but to judge by that early story in Gorgon, the ambition was already established. And it's significant, I think, that the impulse to write prose fiction was pronounced at this stage of his career, and he'd continue to manipulate prose forms all his life. The prose sections in the poetry collections, Stations and District and Circle, give evidence of this. In the case of District and Circle, these epitomize a Proustian dedication to recapturing early moments of life, the vivid memory of his walk to his first local school, which he then surreally connects to the way, and I quote, "the way the Indians of the Pacific Northwest foresaw their arrival in the land of the dead, coming along a forest path where other travellers' cast-offs lay scattered on the bushes. Hearing voices laughing and calling, knowing there was life in the clearing up ahead that would be familiar, but feeling at the same time lost and homesick. Only Heaney could make that extraordinary connection from a childhood memory of going to school through the fields to the travels into the other world preserved in the memories and the folk memories of American Indians. He also wrote in these prose pieces about the haunting presence of families of travellers, adding, I quote, an extraness in the air, as if a gate had been left open in the usual life, as if something might get in or get out. And he ends with an evocation of the peculiar atmosphere on board the ancient bus which took him back to boarding school. And these fragments of found prose, as he calls them, echo poems such as Two Lorries and Route 110, and give again the sense of a Bildungsroman, an account of a journey through life but cast in the form of a novel. The world of childhood recaptured is even more beautifully evoked in the prose of the introductory section of his Nobel lecture crediting poetry, and I must read it because it's, I think, incomparable. In the 1940s, when I was the eldest child of an ever-growing family in rural County Derry, we crowded together in the 3 rooms of a traditional thatched farmstead and lived a kind of den life, which was more or less emotionally and intellectually proofed against the outside world. It was an intimate, physical, creaturely existence in which the night sounds of the horse in the stable beyond one bedroom wall mingled with the sounds of adult conversation from the kitchen beyond the other. We took in everything that was going on, of course. Rain in the trees, mice on the ceiling, a steam train rumbling along the railway line 1 field back from the house. But we took it in as if we were in the doze of hibernation. Ahistorical, pre-sexual, in suspension between the archaic and the modern, we were as susceptible and impressionable as the drinking water that stood in a bucket in our scullery. Every time a passing train made the earth shake, the surface of that water used to ripple delicately, concentrically, and in utter silence. He then moves on brilliantly to the radio messages coming through an aerial fixed in a tree outside, and one of the origins of the messages is Stockholm, and of course he's giving the lecture in Stockholm, receiving the Nobel Prize. This shows, I think, Heaney's immersion in the great tradition of English writing about rural and provincial childhood, which nods not only to Wordsworth and to Hardy, but to D.H. Lawrence, another novelist who wrote poetry. And the early notes and drafts for Heaney's beautiful poem about his mother, which we heard Sinead read earlier, refer specifically to Paul Morel and his mother in Sons and Lovers. These 2 obvious parallels are excised in later drafts of the poem, but they're there at the beginning, and again you get that depth of fictional resonance and reference that he's using. And in other pieces of prose, notably a commentary on the reactions aroused by Ted Hughes's appointment to the Poet Laureateship in 1984, Heaney invokes what's evidently a close acquaintanceship with the fiction of Kingsley Amis to discuss class prejudice in the English world. In a notably bitter polemic, he writes about a country apparently obsessed with its own fatigued class war and its self-wounding industrial crises, whose destiny is debated in terms of economics, whose official church is almost embarrassed by the mention of God, whose universities falter in their trust in the traditional humanist disciplines. Prophetic stuff, we may think, in 2021. The theme of disguised autobiography using fictional modes and fictional strategies can be traced in Heaney's poetry as well as in his prose. Perhaps above all in his powerful sequence of poems about self-examination, Station Island, of which Sinead read the concluding section where he comes up against the ghost of James Joyce. Here, the poet's consciousness comes under a kind of microscope. He's interrogated by dead friends as well as by literary figures who have preceded and inspired him, and he encounters them all while undertaking a pilgrimage on Lough Derg in County Donegal. Several of the sequences are painfully personal, especially again in early drafts. In the poem about his dead friend, the archaeologist Tom Delaney, the subject addresses him in early drafts as Heaney, lucky Heaney. That's changed in later drafts to Seamus, lucky Seamus. And finally, in the final published version of the poem, it's poet, lucky poet, more abstractly. The autobiographical input remains very clear, but Heaney is disguising it by the kind of stylistic tricks which characterize fiction. He does this too, a similar process, in the poem Sweeney Redevivus, which Sinead also read, written about the same time as Station Island. In its earlier drafts, or in its first drafts, it's undisguisedly autobiographical. It's about the flitting bird king of Irish mythology who flies around from tree to tree, avoiding people and complaining, which Flann O'Brien used the same character as well. But in the earlier versions of the poem, this is equated to the poet living between America and Ireland. There are images like yellow taxis come into the early drafts, and trying to preserve his own arena of independence. But these giveaway references are dropped as the poem takes shape. The personal identification becomes more and more evasive in the final version of a poem, which is itself a masterly commentary on evasiveness. And it has a mystery, which I'm sure you inferred from Sinead's wonderful reading. But when you see what it's grown out of, you can see that it's a fragment of autobiography distilled and altered and concealed. And the same is true, of course, of Station Island, though it's more frankly autobiographical. It's published in 1984, and in my opinion, it's the hinge on which much of Heaney's work revolves. It's by turns subtle, self-interrogative, and raw. It ends with that powerful resolution and endorsement of artistic independence, which we heard Sinead read earlier. The writers and mentors whom he encounters as revenants and who advise him include Patrick Kavanagh again, and the 19th century Tyrone novelist William Carleton, as well as friends and acquaintances whose deaths he has memorialized. The poem ends audaciously with that encounter with James Joyce. And this is apposite, because as a text where memory meets self-interrogation, Station Island occupies the place in Heaney's work that the Prelude does in Wordsworth's, or Portrait of the Artist and Stephen Hero in Joyce's. And it's in that Joyce section that Heaney refers very specifically to scenes in Portrait of the Artist, which were for him his own personal epiphanies. It was commensurately long in the making, this poem, and a notebook entry in one of Heaney's notebooks in the National Library of Ireland of 16th of January 1981, years before the poem was published, makes this clear. He writes, "There will have to be some developing scheme in the Lough Derg poem. Now that I feel some grip on the way to do individual pieces, the next thing is to conceive the emerging shape, which should involve, I suppose, changes in the self, as well as definite development in the kind of character encountered at different stages. What changes in the self? An emergence into a kind of independent life, cut off from the, there's an illegible word I can't read, the something of belonging, an ungoverning of the tongue, a loss of interest in historical and sectarian contingencies, an emerging knowledge of the necessary autonomy of the artist, in quotes, within the domestic man, in quotes, a fueling of the imagination, different characters, at beginning, those who define what has produced the self, the pieties, the confinements, the familial, local, and cultural données. Now, what this fascinating outline or instruction to himself strongly suggests is that Heaney was constructing this long poem as an autobiographical novel, patterned along the Joycean and Proustian themes of memory and self-realization. And it's Joyce who, as we've heard, has the last word. Yeats doesn't appear among the guides and revenants because, as Heaney specifically said to Dennis O'Driscoll, this is a Catholic pilgrimage. The encounter with Joyce, which appears as the last section of the sequence, was actually written very early on, at the beginning. Sending a draft of it to Brian Friel in 1980, a year before that journal entry I just read, Heaney described it as, "Here's another madness," envisaged as a possible last scene in Lough Derg. I was asked to contribute to a Joyce symposium for 1982, and that set it off. He doesn't come through properly, but then how can I do a genius? I think there's an answer to that. And there may be a dangerous breach of tact in allowing oneself to meet the man at all. The first page is all right. Maybe he should only say about 4 words. Well, to our lasting benefit, Joyce says much more to him and to us than this. But again, we might note that Heaney is constructing the poem as a novel, as well as anticipating the kind of pursed-lipped reaction which the Joyce section of Station Island would arouse from critics such as Dennis Donoghue, a man to whom pursing the lips came easily. But Heaney successfully risked it, and the audacity of the poem is one reason why I think it's a landmark in his work, as Joyce remained a landmark for Heaney. Listening to him on Desert Island Discs many years ago, I waited for him to choose Yeats's collected poems as his Desert Island book, but no, he chose Ulysses instead. And when Dennis O'Driscoll asked him about the development of his early sound poems like Broach and Anna Horish in Wintering Out, Heaney at once instanced Joyce as the inspiration. He said Joyce was at work downstairs in my mind, lovely image, and he instanced the first paragraph of The Sisters, maybe, where there's this dreamy caress of words like gnomon and simony, or the little deliquescent hymn to the word suck early on in A Portrait of the Artist. But it's not just a matter of poetic language. Heaney identified particularly, as we've heard in the poem, with Portrait of the Artist, especially that famous scene between Stephen and the Dean of Studies, an Englishman, which raises the question of possession of language. The word tundish occurs as opposed to funnel. There's also the injunction at the end of the novel to, exactly as Joyce tells Stephen, to evade the nets of religion and nationalism. When O'Driscoll pressed Heaney hard on why it was Joyce, a prose writer, a novelist, who takes the premier advisory role in Station Island, Heaney fences a bit in his answer. He said, because Joyce qualifies as a poet more than most writers of verse. He enters and explores and exceeds himself by entering and exploring and exceeding the language. My intention always was to have the pilgrim leave the island renewed, with liberating experience behind him and more ahead. The pattern always was the simple one of setting out, encountering tests, and getting through to a new degree of independence. Now, once again, this is the exact structure of a novel or a folk tale, if you think of Vladimir Prop's Functions of the Folk Tale. In another less noticed interview on the publication of Station Island in 1984, Heaney remarked that Joyce's fiction claimed, as all great novelists do, both the collective and the individual worlds. Fascinating insight, I think. This is Heaney. There is an image I have often used of Joyce. He is like an immense factory ship that hoovers up all the experience from the bed of the Irish psyche. If you open Ulysses or A Portrait or Dubliners, you are reading yourself. You're reading the world that you're living in still. Other writers come along and they have very little left. There's very little left to discover. That was in 1984. I think it's a reflection that isn't applicable now in the 40-odd years since Heaney said this, because Irish novelists have charted definitively new territories, have emerged from Joyce's shadow as emphatically as Irish poets have emerged from Yeats's. But it is a reminder of how central to Heaney's imagination Joyce was and remained. That ghost with the walking stick, whose advent forms the climax to Station Island, was a presence in Heaney's life to the end. And the Joycean climax of Station Island deliberately echoes exactly the closure of Portrait of the Artist, where the hero readies himself to push out into the sea of life as an independent mariner steering by his own artistic lights. I hope I've indicated some ways in which Heaney's capacious, indeed Joycean, literary imagination was inspired by the novels close to his heart, and how he employed the strategies of fiction in his poetry. I'd like to end with another of his inspiring fictions, and a writer he turned back to at the end of his life. Writing in the Education Times in 1973, he recalled his childhood reading of Gaelic myths and legends as prescribed by his schoolmasters, and the image of Cuchulainn and Ferdia fighting at the ford. But he admits that these influences were rapidly displaced by Robert Louis Stevenson. He wrote, "All of that yielded to the melodrama of Blind Pew and Billy Bones, Long John and Ben Gunn. Treasure Island we read at school also, and it was a prelude to the first book I remember owning and cherishing. There it was on the table one Christmas morning, Robert Louis Stevenson's Kidnapped. I was a Jacobite for life after that day. Instinctively I knew that the world of the penal rock and the redcoats, that oleograph to the faith of our fathers, was implicit in the scenery of that story. To this day, my heart lifts to the first sentence of it. I will begin the story of my adventures with a certain morning in the months of June, the year of grace 1751, when I took the key for the last time out of the door of my father's house." And it's to Stevenson that Heaney returns, the Stevenson of Treasure Island, in one of those very late poems where transcendence and another world beckons. In this poem he recalls his love of the book Treasure Island and seeing a film of it as a boy, but he opens it up to much more. He marvellously evokes yet again the hero of a story pushing off into a new departure, though in this case he's an aging man at a study desk, facing the uncertainty of memory and the advent of death. The poem shows too how the images and even the quotations from his reading and fiction stayed with him all his life. In my end is my beginning. It's the second last poem in his marvellous last collection, Human Chain, and it's called In the Attic. Like Jim Hawkins aloft in the cross trees of Hispaniola, nothing underneath him but still green water and clean bottom sand. The ship aground, the canted mast far out above a seafloor where striped fish pass in shoals. And when they've passed, the face of Israel Hands that rose in the shrouds before Jim shot him dead appears to rise again. But he was dead enough, the story says, being both shot and drowned. A birch tree planted 20 years ago comes between the Irish Sea and me. At the attic skylight, a man marooned in his own loft, a boy ship-shaped in the crow's nest of a life, airbrushed to and fro, wind-drunk, braced by all that's thrumming up from keel to masthead, rubbing his eyes to believe them and this most buoyant, billowy, topgallant birch. Ghost-footing what was then the terra firma of hallway linoleum, grandfather now appears, his voice a waver, like the draft-prone screen they'd set up in the club rooms earlier for the matinee I've just come back from. And Isaac Hands, he asks, was Isaac in it? His memory of the name a waver too, his mistake perpetual, once and for all, like the single splash when Israel's body fell. As I age and blank on names, as my uncertainty on stairs is more and more the lightheadedness of a cabin boy's first time on the rigging, as the memorable bottoms out into the irretrievable, it's not that I can't imagine still that slight untoward rupture and world tilt, as a wind freshened and the anchor weighed. Thank you. Yes, let's sit down for that. Thank you very much.
So we'll take a few questions in a moment, and I just wanted to say that that lecture reminded me very much of the power or even the capacity to broaden minds and to stimulate thinking because of that observational layering. Observation, which Roy so eloquently put to us tonight. So has anybody would like to start off with the first question? Yes, sir. Good.
Hello, thank you very, very much for that. Wonderful. And also to be here in person is wonderful. I was thinking when you concluded these themes that were coming through of inevitability or coming of death, and him harking back to when he was younger, a young Jim Hawkins type figure. And sitting here now, I'm wondering if his very short piece, A Call, would be something like a Zoom call if it was done now. In that short poem, he seems to put himself back in the position of the young boy, thinking or trying to reach his father. Do you think that there's a sort of a larger narrative that a larger fiction, a larger story that could be told about Heaney and a pursuit of death? Hughes is on my mind when I'm thinking of this, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, and A Call is a very interesting poem. I mean, we assume it's about his father. It might not be. There's certainly the case is to be made that the later poems, especially in District Circle and Human Chain, which I think is one of his greatest collections, his very last, are about transcendence and viewing a transit into the other world that is at the same time going back into your origins and your youth, which is, again, a classic sort of novelist approach. I suppose it's an approach that may be universal. Whether it's a large enough narrative to encompass all that Heaney's doing at this time, because he's very, I think, productive in his very last few years after a certain hiatus, is another matter. And I think his absorption in the classics is terribly important at this point in his life too. And the fact that he has finally buckled down to the Aeneid, and the fact that in poems like My Sinai Lookout, he's going right back to a fascination he's had since school, okay, but it's also something that he has finally come to terms with as parallels for the life the conditions he's observing in life today. So I think the complexity of patterning in his late work can't be simply accommodated by the still very interesting outline that you've given. But I'll go back to A Call and think about it in those terms. Thank you very much.
Anybody next? Anybody else? You're very shy. You're not usually this shy. Yes, Frank. Sorry, I didn't
Frank's
see your
not
hand.
shy.
Frank's less than shy.
One of the things that was very clear from your lecture, Roy, was the enormous number of archival resources that are becoming available for Heaney scholars. So you quoted from letters and a notebook in the National Library. I wondered, do we know much about Heaney's library and Heaney's reading of fiction? What were the great fictional works for him?
Well, there's at least 4 people in the front row that could probably tell you much more than I could. It's hard for me to answer, Frank. I mean, I haven't been through his bookshelves, and I hope that will be possible for scholars. It's made an enormous difference, as I'm sure you know, to Yeats studies, to be able to look at what he read. And indeed, Jack Yeats's library has been given to the National Gallery of Ireland, and it illuminates enormously, at least I thought, how he paints and why he paints what he paints. Heaney's would give the same sort of view, but he's also, as a teacher and a teacher of teachers early in his career, he has to be a kind of magpie gathering up stuff and relaying it. And I thought the outlines in the archive of the anthologies that he thought should be put together for teaching purposes were very interesting. And I think there's a lot of work to be done on them. Unlike with Yeats, I think the archival scatter is less daunting. Emory, probably Harvard, certainly mostly Dublin is where people have to go, and they are going there. Rosie Lavin's book, which I admire greatly, has done marvellous things, I think, with what she was able to find, which had been curiously, well, I shouldn't say curiously, but literary critics look for different things to sociologically or historically minded critics, and that's all to the good. But I think what's happening is that Heaney as a cultural phenomenon is becoming a subject for historians and sociologists, as well as a great poet who is studied by literary critics. That's not a direct answer to your question, but as I say, others can answer it better than me. He did, one thing I would have used in my lecture was an introduction he wrote to a charming novel of Hollywood youth called A Way of Life Like Any Other, written by a friend of his, Darcy O'Brien. And I've read his introduction very carefully to see what kind of literary fictional frame of reference Seamus was using for his evaluation or his introduction to the novel, but it's much more an introduction to the kind of remarkable person Darcy O'Brien was than placing his novel in the history of Hollywood novels or child star novels like, let's say, Gavin Lambert's Inside Daisy Clover, which just rather closely resembles. So I don't know if he read many other Hollywood novels, but maybe somebody else can tell us that later.
Thank you.
Yes, Donal.
Thanks. You said earlier on in your talk, you talked about a continuity in Irish writing, prose and novel writing going back for centuries. I just wondered, the emphasis on the Station Island poem when he talks about flying the nets, as well as being an assertion of artistic independence. Do you think he might also be making a statement about carrying that baton on from Joyce and the other novelists, those poets that you talked about?
Very much so. But at the same time, he was very conscious that this could look arrogant to people who are always ready to think he was getting above himself. He has a very acute sense of that, which he punctured beautifully on many occasions. So it was a risky thing to do, but I think he is definitely putting himself in a continuity there, even not quite an apostolic succession, but Carleton as well is very interesting in that. In that regard, his exchange with Carleton near the beginning of the Station Island sequence is not unlike the exchange with Joyce. Carleton, he recognises in Carleton's life, living in a border county, sectarian hatreds, all the rest of it, he recognises them as his own life too, and Carleton tells him to forget about it and get on with himself. It's a kind of recurrent mantra in that poem, which the more, the whole sequence, which the more I read it, the more it gives up. I think it's an amazingly fecund and fascinating self-examination. And as I say, one wishes he'd written an autobiography. He did almost in Stepping Stones, which is an autobiography in dialogue. But I see elements of autobiography in Station Island as well as the wonderful scattered bits of prose like Crediting Poetry, where he relives his childhood. And that's in a very long tradition as well. What I would love to know is whether he read Proust, because it's a Proustian sense of realizing yourself through reapproaching your childhood, which he mentions in that notebook entry about Station Island. He could be giving a kind of outline of what Proust tried to do in La Recherche, and I think that's very interesting.
Do you think, so I don't want to get into our divided island, but do you think Northerners read Heaney differently than Southerners? Do you think there's a different connection to place and the familiarity with the areas that he spoke about and the rural life that he wrote about in his early work? Do you think that's understood in different ways, or do you think it's understood in very similar ways?
That's a tricky one. I think more and more in similar ways, as one would have hoped, as the border became a more and more elastic and diluted barrier until the last few ghastly years. My own experience of reading Heaney, well, actually my father's experience. My father grew up on a Cavan farm of about 50 acres near the border, and he adored Heaney's work because it spoke to him exactly of what he remembered.
Yeah.
And the atmosphere, and indeed I think in the case of Cavan, quite, or at least of that part of Cavan, quite polite and well manoeuvred differences between the two traditions. The Other Side was a poem my father instinctually knew about and loved very much. So my father by then had been a southerner, so to speak. He'd come in the 1940s to teach in Waterford and remained there all his life. But he certainly read Heaney as, so to speak, an ex-border person, and felt he had a special affinity to it because of that. I think that's less the case now, and Heaney's appeal to urban audiences is enormous, and so it's not just a matter of the recapturing of a world now gone, that he did so brilliantly, especially in the early books, but recurs to again in his later poems. I think also the delicacy with which he approached questions of political sensitivity and difference. They're there in that great Frontiers of Writing lecture and then essay, which I quoted from in my talk. That is a delicacy and a subtlety which is as appealing to Southerners as to Northerners, and as necessary for Southerners as for Northerners. So I think the question of him moving south from the north in 1973 was also a big issue, but no one could ever think of him as any less a northern poet for doing that. So I think I would slightly query your interesting distinction.
He belongs to us. The reason why I asked the question, of course, is because of because some of those things when I first read Heaney was obviously at school, and I was doing my O-levels, which are now called GCSEs or something else. And coming from an Ulster Protestant background, the poem about the shipyard worker and his sectarianism was one of those light bulb moments to me. It was particular to the environment I lived in, because as much as many of the men who live in my community who were industrial workers weren't like that guy, like the shipyard worker and his sectarianism, some were. And it made me realise that this wasn't just my observation, it was the observation of another person.
I think that's well said, and certainly some of the early poems written around the same time as Docker are far more, one wouldn't use the word crude, but they're much more antagonistic in their line, and some unpublished poems around that time are very powerfully polemical.
Yeah.
He didn't publish them, I think, not because he didn't want to be polemical, but because they aren't very good poems. They were apprentice work.
No, so I think the point you made earlier about the apprentice work was it then brought you to that point where you enjoyed that later work as well, and probably in a very different way. Absolutely. Because we all hopefully evolve with our ideas and our concepts. Yes, sir.
This is a question about a personal question for you, Rowan, because what impressed me was the depth of your knowledge and, of course, the depth of the self-exploration that Dean went through in many respects. I'm just wondering how, as someone who's studying an individual like that, how far do you get drawn into that world, and does it lead to self-exploration of a certain kind in you as the studier?
It's the question you ask of any biographer, really.
Yeah.
Though my book isn't really a biography, it's in a series of meditations by one writer on another, but it did take a biographical form. It's a very interesting question you ask. I must stop talking about Dennis Donahue, but he was asked once why he gave up writing a biography of Yeats, which he technically began many, many years ago. And he said because he didn't want to have to become like Yeats and be pompous and up in the air and not recognise his own children in the street and all the rest of it. And I thought it was a rather odd assumption that to write about somebody you had to, in a sense, become them. But maybe it's shared. When you immerse yourself in somebody with as rich and capacious a mind as Yeats or as Seamus Heaney, you certainly absorb some of their breadth of thought. You can never achieve anything like it, but it stretches you. And I think that's one of the reasons why people choose the subjects they do. I certainly felt stretched in reading, especially reading the archival work, seeing the drafts of the poems, seeing how an extraordinarily finished work came out of the first few lines on a page, and reading his own reflections in his notebooks about how these poems came to be. And that is a very inspiring and enlightening thing to do. It also made me think, because this is the first time I've written about somebody whom I knew and whose life overlapped with mine in calendar terms. You know, I remember the first time I read North, for instance, in Hodges Figgis bookshop on Dawson Street, and the feeling of the prickle going down the back of my neck. And so it was a kind of autobiographical focus as well in that way. So there is that as well. You can't not take something away from it, but with Heaney it was a kind of special thing because he touched the history of my own times, as well as, and in the reflection I just said about my father, also from a border farming background, he touched that as well. So it was, yes, it was certainly a broadening and enlightening and expanding experience.
Okay. So thank you very much for your questions, and thank you very much for your answers, Roy. Michael is now going to come forward. Frank, are you coming as well? Is it a two-person show? Okay. So we have every year an undergraduate essay prize, which is the Seamus Heaney Prize, and Michael Heaney and Frank, who you well know, are going to say a few words, and then we will sum up, and you can go and have a little glass of the devil's buttermilk, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pete. And first of all, I just want to thank everyone for being here. It's very strange and wonderful to be in a crowded lecture theatre again. I'd of course like to thank Sinead for your really wonderful readings, which when you hear his poems read in another voice, it brings out things that you missed when he read them, for instance. So that was very, just marvellous. And to Roy for a characteristically thorough and perceptive and just brilliant lecture. It's always kind of humbling when you learn something about your own father in public, and every time this happens, and particularly with his book also capture. I mean, I know you say it's a meditation, but it brought stuff home to me, you know. So he's a fantastic reader of my father's work and his life. And as I say, thank you to the Institute of Irish Studies for bringing us all over here, because Liverpool is also a city very dear to my heart. I love being here by the banks of the Royal Blue Mersey. Anyway, I'm here now actually, this essay contest, I do have to say, would be dear to Dad's heart, because his whole thing was to encourage students to write with honesty and originality and imagination. And it does sound like this year's winner, Arthur Manley, who isn't here tonight, that his sounds like a startling piece of writing, which, much like Station Island, Joyce becomes a vehicle to self-awareness and more than that. But I will, before I get Professor Frank Shovlin to accept the award on behalf of Arthur and to tell us a bit about the essay, I just want to extend to Arthur our congratulations and admiration for the prize. So, and thank you all very much again for being here tonight.
Thanks very much. So I'm accepting the prize on behalf of Arthur Manley. Arthur was a third-year student of mine last year just last spring, on a module I teach on James Joyce. I'm afraid Joyce, yet again, we've got a lot of Joyce tonight. It's inevitable, I suppose, in the Institute of Irish Studies. Arthur did his degree in English literature. The essay was really outstanding. It was about Joyce's Finnegan's Wake and the issue of schizophrenia. And Finnegan's Wake is a notoriously difficult book. And what Arthur argued really is that we've been getting it all wrong. Critics like myself, and he takes to task in particular a famous early book about Finnegan's Wake called A Skeleton Key for Finnegan's Wake, edited by Joseph Campbell. And he says this is not the way we ought to be reading Finnegan's Wake. That he goes back to what Beckett said in one of the very first things that was written about work in progress, as Joyce was calling it then, that this work isn't about anything, it is the thing itself. And he wrote this in absolutely brilliant style. And I was thinking about a phrase that was used earlier tonight about Heaney's early life in South County Derry, that it was a kind of den life. And I was thinking then about this past year, or this 20 months of pandemic and lockdowns. And one of the side effects of that is, whether they liked it or not, is my wife and small children got to know a lot more about what I do, including marking. And I remember marking Arthur Manley's essay, and I'd be shouting across to Maura, my wife, wait till you hear this, get a load of this. And it was a truly exciting, wonderful essay, and I'm delighted to accept the prize on behalf of Arthur. And given that the essay was about James Joyce, I was delighted that the Station Island piece was read and recited tonight. And I was thinking about those lines that James Joyce, the ghost of James Joyce, says to Heaney on the Lochderg pilgrimage. What you do, you must do on your own. The main thing is to write for the joy of it. Thank you very much.